About a year ago, when my book came out, Hundred Greatest Americans of the 20th Century, as well as the Wilson's Hall of Fame, which will be for sale after the film's over. I've already sold it to you while I was waiting. When the book came out, I was interviewed by Bill Moyers, and he asked me, is there anybody in the, you pick one person that you wrote about in the book who you think really is unrecognized and needs to be more visible, who would it be? And I said Bayard Rustin, a year ago. And so you can imagine how thrilled I was when last week President Obama announced that Bayard Rustin is going to be awarded posthumously, because he died in 1987, posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor in the whole country. Pretty remarkable. And, what's even more remarkable is that Bayard Rustin has really been an almost invisible figure for most of the last 50 years since the March on Washington. And primarily because he had 4 strikes against him, which made it hard for him to be a public figure during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, his heyday. He was black, he was a socialist, he was gay, and he was a pacifist. And he was considered probably the greatest organizer of his period, and yet he was, for most of his life, he was a behind-the-scenes person because of the stigma attached primarily to having been gay and openly gay and a socialist. And so I want to talk a little bit, in introducing the movie, a little bit about Bayard Rustin and a little bit about the March on Washington, some things that are not that well known about either him or the march, some of which are hinted at in the movie but not really talked about very much. And then after the movie's over, I'd be happy to answer questions or facilitate a discussion about anything that you find of interest in the movie. I have some notes here. So one thing about Rustin you should know is that he grew up in a home in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and became a devout Quaker very early in his life, and became a radical, flirted a little bit with the Communist Party in the 1930s. He was born in 1912, and last year was his 100th anniversary of his birth. And his parents were activists in the NAACP, which had just started back then, mostly around issues of lynching. And so when famous people like W.E. Du Bois would come through the Philadelphia area, they'd stay at his house. He lived with his grandparents. And so he was sort of born to be a radical. And in high school, as the movie describes, and later in college, he continued his activism around civil rights, but also around economic justice, around peace, around nonviolence. Some people called him the American Gandhi. He was very much influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, the Indian pacifist, and who helped to bring about the independence of India. And he was very much a fringe radical, meaning that he was involved in lots of small little organizations that were at the cutting edge of social change, but weren't well known to the general public. One of them was called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a peace group. Another was called the War Resisters League. He had 2 mentors, which the movie mentions briefly. A. Philip Randolph, the great African-American labor and civil rights leader, and a socialist who influenced Rustin to become active in labor and radical issues. And the other was A.J. Muste, also a labor organizer and a Protestant minister who was probably the leading pacifist of the 20th century in the United States. And he lived out his values. He was, as the movie describes, he was in jail for resisting World War II. He refused to register for the draft. He was beat up in jail. He was segregated. He organized, when he got out of jail, he organized the March of Reconciliation, Journey of Reconciliation, which was the first freedom ride. And so he was, and he was a very peripatetic kind of Johnny Appleseed character. He'd go around to speaking in churches and colleges and community groups all over the country, usually on a bus, usually hitchhiking, and speaking to small groups, but in doing so, he recruited lots of people to the progressive, radical, pacifist movement. A lot of college students became his followers. But he wasn't a major public figure. And then something happened here in Pasadena, which is mentioned briefly in the movie, but I do want to talk about it, A, because we're in Pasadena, and B, because it really was one of the key turning points in his life. In 1953, 52 and 53, the end of 52, beginning of 53, he was on a tour of Africa. He believed in African independence against British and French and Dutch colonialism. He believed that the American civil rights movement should connect with movements for independence around the world. And he had just come back from Africa, and he was on a West Coast speaking tour. And on January 21st, 1953, he spoke at the Pasadena Athletic Club, which most recently was over on Walnut, but in the 1950s was where Paseo, Colorado is now. Yeah. And he spoke at a talk sponsored by the American Association of University Women and the American Friends Service Committee, the Quaker Friends group. And he was speaking about world affairs and about his trip to Africa. The talk was at night. After the talk was over, he mingled and talked to people in the audience. And then he started walking back from the athletic club on Colorado to the Green Hotel on Raymond, where he was staying. But he never got there because, and this is where the story isn't quite clear, either he solicited or he was solicited by two young men in a car, and the Pasadena police arrested these Bayard Rustin and these two men for having sex in the backseat of the car. And he was, the next day he was brought to trial, to court, and he was found guilty of lewd and lascivious deviant behavior, that's what they called it back then. And he spent 60 days in the LA County jail. At the time, every state in the country criminalized homosexuality. And as a result, and it was called a perversion or deviant. And the Pasadena police routinely had raids on gay bars, of which there were some in Pasadena, Brookside Park, where gay men used to go to find each other, and some street corners where they would meet. And they would arrest them and throw them in jail. There was even a scam going on, which I learned about, which was that the Pasadena police would arrest the men, but not make it public if they would go to a therapy to learn how to not be gay anymore by this unlicensed doctor. And they had to pay for these therapy sessions by this unlicensed doctor in Pasadena. And it turns out the police were getting a cut of the money. One of the most famous people who were rounded up during these raids was a very well-known physician here in Pasadena named William Bliss, who was the medical director at Huntington Hospital. And he was arrested one day by the Pasadena police, and the next day he committed suicide. So this was a tragic situation for gay people in America back in the 40s and 50s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And Bayard Rustin was an openly gay man, but he had never been arrested before. And all of us, he'd been arrested for lots of political things, but never for homosexuality. And his employers, particularly A.J. Muskie, the pacifist, at the Fellowship of Reconciliation, thought, this is going too far. We can't, we're radical enough, right? Being a pacifist group. We can't afford to be stigmatized by having our key organizer, Bayard Rustin, be arrested homosexual. with an arrest record, and so they fired him. He was very close to A.J. Munter. It was very painful for him to fire. So he was fired, but his other mentor, A. Philip Randolph, picked him up and hired him for the other group that he spent much of his career working for, the War Resisters League. And it was in 1954, while he was still working for the War Resisters League, but always undercover, always very quietly, that A. Philip Randolph had heard about this thing going on in Montgomery, Alabama, this bus boycott that was started by Rosa Parks. There was a young minister who was 26 years old named Martin Luther King, who was becoming a leader of the movement, but had no political experience. King was completely a neophyte about organizing. And so A. Philip Randolph sent, as you'll see in the movie, he sent Rustin down to Montgomery to meet with King and to meet with the leaders of the boycott to help them strategize. And it was then that he and King became very close. King was clearly homophobic, knew that Rustin was gay, but he was so brilliant and was so useful that King could not resist taking his advice and learning from him. It was Rustin that convinced King to get rid of the guns in his house because he was afraid of being killed because his house was getting bombed during the boycott and so forth. It was Rustin that that helped him figure out how to prolong the boycott beyond a couple of weeks. It was Rustin that had the idea that when the boycott was over, they should build an organization to expand the civil rights movement around the South, which became the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Rustin wrote a lot of the speeches for King. He wrote a lot of the articles that were published under King's name, and he helped ghostwrite one of his books. So he really was a very, and at one point, J. Edgar Hoover and John Kennedy said to King, "You got to get rid of this guy Rustin because he's going to cause you trouble." And so after a while, he had to arrange to meet and talk to King through an intermediary. So he really was an important figure, but again, behind the scenes. A. Philip Randolph had this idea for a march on Washington, which you can see about back in 1941. And when Roosevelt was president, in order to integrate the war jobs. And then he had another idea back in the 60s, early 60s, to have another march on Washington. He said this one actually would do it. They didn't do the first one because Roosevelt came in and integrated the war industry, the defense industry. So he turned to Rustin, his closest aide, and said, write me a memo on how we're going to do this. And he wrote a 3-page memo on how to build momentum for a March on Washington, which was originally called a March on Washington for Jobs. It was about full employment. Back in the early 1960s, 55% of all African Americans were below the poverty level. 55%. There were only 3 African Americans in Congress. It was, a whole different situation back then. So it was about jobs, but then he brought together a lot of civil rights groups, and they agreed, we'll make this a march for civil rights, for desegregation, and for full employment. And I will pass out the demands. I won't read them all. The 10 demands of this is the original 10 demands of the March on Washington, most of which have to do with economic justice as well as civil rights. And those are written by Rustin. So a couple more thoughts, and then we'll show the movie. So the March on Washington was a huge success. It's looked back on history as a march for civil rights and as the thing that helped persuade Congress to pass Kennedy's Civil Rights Act, which was going nowhere. What's also important to realize is that a couple months before the March on Washington was the famous Birmingham protests, where King was arrested and went to jail, and that caused Kennedy to get more involved in civil rights. And then the March on Washington happened. And as you'll see in the movie, some of the civil rights leaders who helped Randolph organize the march, who were the heads of the major national civil rights organizations, some of them didn't want Rustin to be the public face of that march because of his background and the stigma attached to it. And so some of the books and articles that I've read about Rustin in the last couple of weeks since last week really, when Obama named him for the Presidential Medal of Freedom, said that that he was the behind-the-scenes organizer of the March on Washington. And that's partly true, but it's mostly not true. And here are two examples of why. After the march was over, after the 10 speakers, Martin Luther King, Roy Wilkins, John Lewis, who's now a congressman, who then was the head of Student Nonviolent Coordinating, there were 10 speakers. As Terry said, there were lots of singers, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Marian Anderson, the opera singer, Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, Bob Dylan, and so forth. After all those speakers were done, Bayard Rustin got up in front of 250,000 people. Here's the photograph, as you've probably seen. I know it's hard to see, but it's a photograph of Rustin with his hands up like this. You'll see it in the movie. Speaking to 250,000 people, saying, here are the demands of our march. I want to know whether you consent to these demands. And he read them off one at a time, and then each time he read them, the crowd of 250,000 people yelled, yes, yes, amen, we're for this, right? So, and this was televised around the world. Satellite TV had just gotten started, so you could actually televise this around the world. So Bayard Rustin was not a totally behind-the-scenes figure during the March on Washington. He was out there in front of 250,000 people. And then the next week, the cover of Life magazine, in reporting on the March on Washington, put it on its cover and had a picture of, not of Martin Luther King, who had made that brilliant I Have a Dream speech, but of A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. And so he was coming out of the shadows by this march. And his life was about to change. And then, after the march was over, he continued his activism. He was still a speaker who was highly requested by lots of civil rights and college groups, but he never, again, had it was a kind of a peak moment of the March on Washington. One more thing about the march itself. The march was very controversial. Kennedy tried to convince Randolph to stop it. He said, if you have this march, it'll be harder for me to get the bill through, the civil rights bill through. Because everybody assumed there'd be violence. Everybody assumed if you had 50,000, 100,000, or 250,000 people in Washington in front of the Jefferson Memorial, you would, because a lot of black people would be there, there'd be a riot. And that's everybody was reporting. And so they made a big push to make sure it was nonviolent, and it was. There wasn't one incident. It was the largest protest rally in the history of America up until that time. And finally, in order to try to discredit the march, a week or so before the march happened, Strom Thurmond, the senator, the segregationist senator from South Carolina, who was the leading filibuster against civil rights legislation, stood up on the floor of the Senate and read Bayard Rustin's arrest record for the Pasadena arrest and put it into the congressional record. I have a copy of the arrest record, which I'll pass out. The intention, of course, was to discredit the march by pointing out that Bayard Rustin was gay and was a communist and so forth. And so his biographer, a guy named John D'Amelio, who wrote this wonderful biography, the best biography of Rustin. If you want to read more about him, this is the book called Bayard Rustin, The Lost Prophet, The Life and Times of Bayard Rustin. His biographer, John D'Amelio, says that as soon as Strom Thurmond read that into the congressional record, Bayard Rustin became the most famous homosexual in America. But he didn't get involved in the gay rights movement until much later in his life. So this is the book to read if you want to know more about Bayard Rustin. This is the book to read if you want to know more about the March on Washington. This came out a month ago by a history professor at the University of Wisconsin named William Jones. It's just called The March on Washington. It's easy to remember. And it talks about the radical roots of the March on Washington and how it was really the idea of these socialist, labor, and civil rights activists who wanted to redistribute wealth and power. In retrospect, we think of it as this great celebration of American progress, but the demands were much more radical. Anyway, I talked longer than I thought I would. So I'm going to pass out, before the movie starts, I'm going to pass out two things. You look out, please later, don't read them while the movie's going on. One are the list of demands and the program for the March on Washington, and the other is the arrest record here in Pasadena of Bayard Rustin. Thank you. You know, I don't want to have to do a speech. You know, I'm happy to answer questions or find anything. So, in the back.
Yeah, I find it sadly humorous that freedom and/or wealth in this country, you know, Strom Thurmond was saying, and then you hear people equals having a refrigerator. You know, I thought, oh my God, that's the same argument that people are using to try and cover up things that are happening, and it's so ridiculous. But people seem to sort of absorb that message. Why do you think that is? I don't know why is that appealing to be able to deliver that?
Well, we're a very materialist culture, and we've been taught, particularly since the end of World War II, we became a consumption society, that what you buy and what kind of car you have and so forth is a sign of your worth as a person. I don't think it's a race thing. I think it's a general cultural thing. But I also think there's a lot of rebellion against that. And I think the younger generation is much less materialistic than my generation, for example. And it's a much longer conversation about materialism and individualism. But and I also think that the movements for social justice that I talk about in my book, the movements that Bayard Rustin we're talking about, they were moral and spiritual movements as well as movements for just redistribution of economic wealth. And if you listen carefully, if you read carefully Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, he talks about the importance of housing and jobs and raising the minimum wage, all the things that are in that list. But he also talks about the importance of character, morality, and the fabric of our social lives. And I think the civil rights movement and the labor movement today is about a lot of those issues as well. So, okay, yeah.
I was just wondering how you feel that his life certainly fascinating doing witness today. When did it come to the attention as president? How was he nominated for that?
So the question is, how did Obama learn about Rustin, and how did he learn about, how did he nominate him for the presidential
Yeah.
So there's been a movement to try to get Rustin nominated for this over the last decade or so. And Obama, it's not clear whether he ever met Rustin, but he clearly knew about him. Remember, Bayard Rustin was probably one of the great organizers of the 20th century. Obama was a community organizer. And he learned about community organizing from the teachings of Saul Alinsky. And when he went to work in Chicago as an organizer, he read Alinsky's books. But Rustin was Rustin is a lot older than Obama was, obviously. But Rustin was still somebody who, if you were a serious organizer in the 1980s, when Obama was being an organizer in Chicago, you knew about Bayard Rustin. Well, first of all, he nominated, he announced last week, I think there are 9 or 10 people that are going to get the presidential medal of freedom. It's not just one person. It included Oprah Winfrey, it included Bill Clinton, it included C.P. Vivian, who was a minister in the South who was active in the civil rights movement, it included a couple of musicians and other people like that. I'm part of a movement now that's trying to get him to nominate somebody next year named Fred Ross, who was an organizer who discovered or identified Cesar Chavez and taught Cesar Chavez how to be an organizer. So, you know, it's been bubbling up below the surface for a while. But I have to say, as I said, I'll say it again, it is incredibly courageous for Obama.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, you know, But the timing is perfect, right? Because it's the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, right? And Obama came out in favor of same-sex marriage less than a year ago. And, you know, I think it's, you know, you can't divorce the fact that the timing and Obama's own political career and evolution and thinking is part of the calculation. Right? But despite that, I think it's a wonderful and somewhat courageous thing for Obama to do. Yes, about walk it.
Having lived through all of this is like yesterday for me.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a movement to take us backwards. And how do we go fight against that? Because the movement seems to be stronger to take us backwards than to move us forward.
So
that's our challenge.
So the question is, you know, we're looking backwards 50 years. What about forward? I have an article that's coming out in the Washington Post next week, a week from tomorrow, a couple of days before the 50th anniversary of the march. And it's called "What Would King Do Now?" And I tried to think, if Martin Luther King were alive today, what would he be doing? And it was pretty eye-opening to me to remind myself, well, even though I knew this, that he would be participating in the Moral Monday protests in North Carolina against the attempt to limit voting rights. He would be sitting in with students in Florida at the governor's office against efforts to try to get the state of Florida to eliminate the stand-your-ground gun laws. He'd be helping the striking workers at Walmart and at the fast food restaurants that were on strike a couple of weeks ago and will continue to be on strike. He would be involved in Texas and other states protesting against the shutdown of Planned Parenthood. Martin Luther King was the Planned Parenthood clinics. He was the first recipient of the Margaret Sanger Award in 1966 from Planned Parenthood.
Oh, wow.
People don't know that about him.
No, I didn't know.
He would be getting arrested with people fighting for immigrant rights.
Yeah.
He would be fighting, he would be thrilled by Eric Holder's speech the other day about the mass incarceration. We have to change our drug laws to stop the mass incarceration, particularly of young black men in prison. There are 2.5 million Americans in prison. He would be on the front lines of the campaign to stop people from being foreclosed in their homes, particularly in African American and Latino neighborhoods. There are incredible movements happening right now that are part of the spirit of the March on Washington, that continue the spirit of the March on Washington, and that Martin Luther King would be continuing to give his voice, his body, and his moral message. And there are, so we don't have to look back and say, isn't it a shame that we don't have a Martin Luther King today? We don't have a Bayard Rustin. We do. We don't have somebody as famous as Martin Luther King. We don't need somebody as famous as Martin Luther King, because as my book describes, you know, it's good to have leaders, but you have to have a grassroots movement.
Right.
And there's a great movement here in California to pass laws to give workplace rights to domestic workers.
Yeah.
Right, called the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. That's going to pass sometime in the next year because Governor Brown is going to be pressured to sign it. And so there's, you know, one of the themes of my book, and one of the themes of Bayard Rustin's life, I think, is that the radical ideas of one generation become the common sense. Fanfare for this. The radical ideas of one generation are often the common sense of the next. Right? But you have to build a movement, and these radical ideas become common sense. You think about what the things Bayard were in that March on Washington demands. Many of them have happened.
Yeah.
As I said back in, you know, the right to vote and the right to women to have reproductive freedom and all kinds of. I mean, it doesn't mean things are all better. There's a lot of, you go 2 steps forward, you go 1 step backwards. But what Bayard Rustin understood is you have to win victories. Sometimes you lose and then you continue. And then what he understood was that to be a social justice activist, you have to be a long distance runner. You can't be a sprinter. So it's a lifetime You don't win everything, even in your own lifetime. So we're still the leg. We all stand on Bayard Rustin's shoulders, and he was just a remarkable person for that. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to the lady in back and to all of us who were moved by Bayard Rustin's life. And for those people who are here who are citizens of Pasadena, I'm Chris Overhauser with the American Civil Liberties Union here in Pasadena. And currently, if you follow the press, you know that our police department is under a cloud of corruption, for racial profiling in Northwest Pasadena. And ACLU and the newspapers editorially are all calling for civilian oversight, or rigorous civilian oversight of the police department. And I just wanted to say, if any of you are interested in helping to find out more about that and helping to bring this to pass, please see the ad.
Great. ACLU does great work here. Just a few more questions and then we'll go. Go ahead.
In your books, you include
Who? Oh, no. So the question is, will I include Adam Clayton Powell in my list of 100 critics? There are a lot of people in the movie that are in my book. Obviously, Dr. King, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, and I have Lyndon Johnson in the book, which is probably the most controversial person in the book. But there are a couple of Congress people in the book. I thought Powell was both a force for good, as the movie said, and quite a manipulator and a force for evil in some ways. Well, Lyndon Johnson had the power to make good things happen, including the Civil Rights Bill, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and he had the power to make bad things happen in Vietnam. And I say that in the book, right? It's schizophrenic. But Adam Clayton Powell also was personally quite corrupt.
Yeah.
I make a point in the book that none of the people in my book, all hundreds, none of them are saints, including Martin Luther King. They all have flaws. They're all products of their time. Some of them tried to work to overcome their flaws. Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was a eugenicist. Yeah. Part of her life. But she overcame that, changed her views. So I have quite a number of Congress people in the book, but I didn't think Powell merited that. And, but what I like about, what's fun about having my book out there is exactly this. I've gotten thousands of emails since the book came out. So it's like, why did you put that person in? Why didn't you put this person in? That's, I wanted to spark a conversation about.
I don't disagree with that. I disagree. Do you agree with Andy Young's comment, though? No one controlled or civil rights legislation before?
No.
So I don't actually tell you the
No, he also stopped some good legislation. Very comfortable. I think Bill Lawyers had this wonderful episode on the show 4 years ago. We talked about the interaction between the insiders and the outsiders. Martin Luther King was invited to the White House, and Johnson tried to get him to stop the Montgomery and Selma protests. And he said, "You're making it harder for me to get the civil rights bill." And King said, "We've waited a long time. I'm a leader, but I can't stop this protest even if I want to. And so we have to continue to protest. And believe me, Mr. President, I'm helping you pass the bill. And later, Johnson admitted he was right. So even though Powell was a force in the Congress, at the time, remember I said before, there were only about 4 African Americans in Congress. But he was the most powerful one. He was probably the most effective one. But I think if Kennedy couldn't get his own bill through. Right. It took Johnson. And at that point, Powell wasn't that important. Okay, but this is good. 2 more.
Just a quick observation. I was just thinking of during the course of the movie that as much progress as we've made, every single time Rustin was speaking, I just kept thinking, He could be right here today making
Yeah,
that
that
same
same
speech
speech.
about this
Exactly.
issue,
Yeah.
whether it's education or not to take back any of the great progress that we've made, but I just found that to be remarkable.
Yeah.
Well,
In a sad
I
way.
don't think that's true. It is true that his moral force would resonate with us right now, and he'd be talking about different issues. Remember, 5 years ago, the idea of same-sex marriage was completely off the table.
I guess I'm talking more of a spiritual force. Like if he's talking about we need to morally come together as this or that, of course he's a product of this time. And you're right, of course. I mean, it would be different issues. But the way he was expressing himself,
Oh,
the way that
absolutely.
I just feel like he could be right here using the same language, the same verbiage, and it would be applicable to what we're fighting right now. You know?
I agree. Yeah, because the Martin Luther King said that the arc of
History.
is long, but it bends towards justice.
Right.
But the people in my book and Bayard Rustin and King, somebody has to bend the arc.
Yeah.
It doesn't bend itself automatically. And Bayard Rustin was one of those people that bent the arc and made justice happen. And there are tens of thousands of people in the country right now who are doing the same thing, including people here in Pasadena. And the press, I mean, what's different about it is that in 1963, the March on Washington, the war in Vietnam hadn't yet really escalated. It was the central issue of America.
Mm-hmm.
And most people had to take a position one way or the other. And it was the beginning of television.
Right.
And so the protests in the South, particularly in Birmingham, a couple of months before the March on Washington, were really, were in our face as a country. And Martin Luther King became famous at the March. He wasn't that famous until the March on Washington. And so he became kind of the spiritual leader of the progressive movement. And there's no one person like that now, and there's not one issue that divides the country in a way that we can all agree on. As I said, there's all these different issues, but they're all part of as King understood, as Rustin, they're all part of the same broader themes of economic and social justice. And I think that, so the period that they lived in back then, in '63, I was only 15 years old. My parents went to the march, so they didn't bring me. I was pissed off, actually. But I remember them coming back, and I remember all the conversation at our dinner table, besides do your homework, right, was, about civil rights. And I think right now, people, Occupy Wall Street and other issues, people are talking about lots of different things, but they're all, my students at Occidental are interested in environmental justice, interested in gay rights, women's issues, sexual assault, all kinds of, but they all understand that it's ultimately about power, right? Economic and social power. And you have to have a movement to make change. You can't just do it by laws or by feeling good or by recycling. You can't do that. On its own, none of that happens. Okay, I still have one more question.
I was just going to say that last year was the 100th anniversary of his book.
Yes.
And I know the Architect Service Committee made a big deal of last
Yes.
year with a lot of programs and stuff. How pretty it was.
Yeah.
I also, as a child, knew Bayard Rustin.
Oh, wonderful.
Just because he made a lot of
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing about Rustin that I didn't mention, actually, there's two things I want to say that I forgot to say earlier. One is there was a big debate during the week leading up to the March on Washington. If you look at the list of speakers, there's not one woman. Mahalia Jackson and Marian Anderson sang. Not one woman was there. And there were some powerful civil rights leaders who were women who wanted to speak. And Rustin and King and A. Philip Randolph and Roy Wilkins and NAACP, they would have nothing to do with it. And a lot of those women became the leaders of the women's movement a couple of years later. The second-class citizenship of women inside the civil rights movement and then inside the civil rights movement was a very powerful force that led to the founding of a number of women's caucuses and organizations. I want to say that. The second thing I wanted to point out is that,
movie didn't, I forget when the movie came out, it might have come out before this happened. 10 years ago, the city of Westchester, Pennsylvania, town, school district in Westchester, built a new high school. This is a Republican town. The county, Westchester County, my cousin lives there. 86% Republican.
Shocking.
And, 86% white,
Yeah.
and over 60% Republican. They voted for Romney. There was a movement in Westchester among the three liberals, or whatever, to name the new high school after Bayard Rustin. And they did.
Oh my God.
So the new high school was built, they named it in 2002, it was built, it opened about 2006. And when I was writing an article about Rustin last year, I called up the principal, African-American woman with a PhD, I forgot her name now. I interviewed her, I said, is this like my daughters, if I go to, my daughters went to McKinley middle school here in Pasadena, if you asked them who McKinley is, they wouldn't know. So I said, do your students know who Bayard Rustin is? And every year, well, first of all, there's a big picture of Bayard Rustin when you walk in the front door. Secondly, every year we have a birthday celebration of Bayard Rustin's life, and that the history teachers all have to teach about Bayard Rustin. So these white middle class students from Republican families learn about Bayard Rustin.
Oh my goodness.
It's quite remarkable that in his hometown, although he was a forgotten figure for most of his life, he's now revered figure whose name adorns the local high